G'day and welcome back to Critical AFL on YouTube. Today we're going to get into the results from the Western Derby number 60, including how some of the key matchups from my match day preview went, where the game was won and lost, who played well, and what it's going to take for West Coast to turn around one of the glaring weaknesses that we're currently struggling with this year, which is the contested ball differential in the midfield that keeps rearing its head. But first, before we get into it, I'd like to include my personal request to anybody enjoying this content to consider subscribing to the channel. As many of you may know, these videos take a lot of personal spare time, and I currently like to describe the work as a very time-consuming hobby, especially until this channel is monetized, which requires a minimum of 1,000 subscribers. So if you've been enjoying these videos and haven't done so yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free. It means you'll always have access to the latest videos that come out on the channel, and it is a huge help to making this work sustainable in the long term. And on that note, let's get into the Derby review. We'll start with a few of the key matchups that I mentioned in my Derby preview and how they went. The first of those matchups being the contest between Brady Hough and Shai Bolton. As predicted, West Coast lockdown specialists got the job on Shai Bolton. And I think it's a pretty fair assessment to say Hough did win that battle. Bolton did manage to get a decent possession count by the end of the game, but most of those were forced up the field outside the 50-metre arc, which I credit to Hough. And Bolton also was kept goalless throughout the match, which is a pretty impressive achievement from Hough, considering the amount of supply that Fremantle and their forward line got all day. Unfortunately, this is the only key matchup that West Coast won out of the three that I listed. In the centre of the ground, Luke Jackson got a hold of West Coast's ruck duo, Bailey Williams and Archer Reid, collecting 35 hitouts, which was more than both of the pair combined, as well as collecting 17 disposals around the ground and a goal, which is also something I mentioned in the preview, that he can turn into a fourth midfielder, not just against us, in other games too, when he starts to really get going. So it was a pretty impressive performance that contributed to Fremantle's dominance of the contested possession battle in the middle, which I also did mention before the game as a defining statistic in the match preview. But I'm going to cover that topic at the end of this video, as it's going to form part of the key takeaways from the match, and one of the major factors that West Coast will need to turn around in order to compete this season. So the third key matchup I mentioned was between Josh Tracy and Harry Edwards, which unfortunately we also lost. I don't think Edwards played poorly at all, but at the end of the day, the inside 50 count was 65-37 in Fremantle's favour. And with all the supply he received, Tracy ended up with 3 goals, while Edwards was actually substituted off the field before three-quarter time. So now that we know how these key matchups played out, it's worth taking a look at who played well for West Coast and who also put in the promising performances, which I always enjoy putting out there. Before I go through the key takeaways from the game, because unlike the Gold Coast loss in round 1, which we did lose similarly at the coalface, there was actually a lot more players who contributed across that squad of 23, and a fair few promising signs as well from guys who may not have quite made it into our best players. So at the top of the best list, I thought Jack Graham was really reliable in the middle, particularly in the first half. So in a match where we were once again dominated for contested possession in the midfield, Graham was one of the few guys in there trying to wrestle that control back from Fremantle. That might sound familiar because I have said that in a few games that we do find ourselves in. Unfortunately, the other mids didn't fire, so it was just a little bit too big a job for Graham, who did play the role that he's got in there. The next best player I thought was Ryan Marrick. Marrick outdid what I personally said was his career best game last week, with an even better one this week against Fremantle. He's just got that composure and class that you'd usually expect from a 100-gamer out there. And I can't help but feel every time I watch him that I'm looking at some mixture of Mark Lacroix and Dean Kemp hybrid playing out there in the modern game whenever he's got the ball. I'm not sure how many of you guys remember Dean Kemp, but they're both pretty silky players, and he's got a very clean disposal. He finished the game with a team high of 28 disposals, and even though a fair few of those were from kickouts, not all of them, not all the kickouts for him, sorry, his disposal efficiency was elite as usual. And for the second week in a row, he managed to run the ball all the way to the 50-metre arc from kick out, which is a bit of a unique skill because it wasn't based on speed. He kind of just kept pushing forward, looking like he was about to take his kick. And the defensive zone just didn't move towards him until he basically got himself to the 50-metre arc. So there's a bit of a rare, unique ability there. I also enjoy saying this all year about Tyrell Dewar, and once again, I'm happy to say that he was in our best players this week. I think we've unearthed a full-time wingman for a long time to come now, and I'm really looking forward to hearing that contract extension that I predicted to be announced any day now. I also think it's important to mention Jeremy McGovern's impact in the Derby. While I don't usually go on too much about the senior players who I've already kind of referred to as known quantities in a rebuilding side, I think McGovern was quite possibly worth another 10 goals that Fremantle may have kicked if he wasn't out there. The bad news is it looks like he may be unavailable for a while, coming off in the fourth quarter with a groin injury. Hopefully, at best, that could be 1 to 2 weeks, but you never really quite know until the scans come out, so we'll have to watch for that. The other players who were really good for us included Liam Baker, once again, who I think has already well and truly justified the trade capital he cost to get him over to West Coast. Ruben Jinby had yet another really reliable performance off half-back, and Liam Ryan was a lot more damaging than the stats sheet would show for anyone who didn't actually get a chance to watch the game. So outside of our best players, there were a couple of younger guys who showed some really exciting upside to look forward to in the year ahead. And the first of those was Archer Reed, who finally got his first goal in AFL football in the third quarter and then got his second goal after in the fourth. But more importantly, he actually could have ended up with 4 if he'd been able to convert all his opportunities, which is really impressive for a 19-year-old key forward who also got thrown a lot of minutes pinch hitting in the ruck as well. So wasn't even full-time at that forward line as well. The other exciting player I thought was Harley Reid. And I say this not because he was in our best players, but because I did mention in my preview video that he looked really compromised in the first couple of games this year. And a lot of those little signs of him struggling weren't there in the Derby. He managed to finish the game with a handful of highlights, including a massive hanger inside 50 that he finished with a goal. And he probably could have kicked about 3 if he'd converted all his opportunities. His total possession count of 15 wasn't incredible, but it was more the result of the attention he was getting from Fremantle rather than anything he was doing wrong. So hopefully that's a step in the right direction and he can start to get off the leash a little bit in the coming weeks. I do think that he's going to look a lot better once Elliot Yeo's back in the side, which kind of leads me to the key takeaway for the match. And that is that outside of the key matchups that we mentioned and how they went, the other factor I mentioned in the Derby preview that would impact the outcome of the match was the contest in the midfield. It's something that got really ugly against Gold Coast in round 1, and it was also really concerning in our pre-season win against North Melbourne. And for anyone who's thinking that's a bit of an oxymoron to refer to a concerning win, did put a review video out of that one. If you haven't seen it or you can't remember, you can go check it out. But basically, it was a very similar battle in the midfield where they controlled the game mostly, but just didn't get the score. And again, in the Derby, that midfield battle reared its head again. And if I'm being honest, I actually think that the margin of 38 points was flattering to West Coast. I know the scoreboard probably doesn't quite look like it again if you didn't watch the game because their goals to points ratio is pretty even. But they were really inaccurate with a lot of gettable set shots. And that scoreline probably should have been a lot worse than it was. And at the root of this was the contested possession count in the midfield, which was in particular led by Caleb Sarong. Sarong won the Glendinning Allen medal with 35 disposals and 17 of them were contested, which was a performance that actually reminded me a lot of Patrick Cripps in round 23 last year. That was when Carlton was missing half their side and he just ran riot in there without anyone being able to stop him from start to finish. So I do think that is starting to really turn into a big issue. On that note, it might actually be worth talking a little bit about what West Coast can do to turn the contested weakness around and also at the same time fast track the rebuild by doing so. But what it would take is West Coast being really brave and taking some risks in that midfield. To put it quite simply, I think West Coast needs to just create a sink or swim environment for some of our young guys and swap our classy first string mids out for some aggressive young talent. And I don't mean entirely at the selection table, just dropping all the guys that we lean on week to week, but at least in terms of midfield minutes and also centre bounce setups throughout the game. And before I get carried away with this one, especially since I'm sure I'm giving off some serious armchair expert vibes, I'm going to premise the suggestion with about 3 years of really consistent observations. So basically, during our injury crisis, I was always surprised with how competitive the side was when almost all the mids were out and it was just young guys. And inversely, it doesn't mean that we didn't get belted, by the way. It just means that the way that we competed in the midfield was almost admirable in some of the losses that we expected to be our worst ones. And inversely, I was also really surprised at how flat we were when a lot of the senior guys were back from injury. And that comes down to a couple of things. Number one, and this is just being fair, like the counter argument, when you come back from injury, there's no way to find form in that. It's you're just playing guys that have no match fitness and probably still have no built-up fitness from missing out on pre-seasons but with injury. And I always thought the expectation of Adam Simpson was a bit unfair, considering he spent 3 years trying to either coach that reserve side or a squad of senior players that didn't have any match fitness. But the other part of this is that too, what the young guys lack in experience and composure, they do make up for with physicality and enthusiasm. And we've seen that so many times because of the injury crisis. So I know it sounds abstract, but at the end of the day, the senior guys are often just in there swimming upstream without that perfect balance of A graders around them to share the load. So it just becomes too taxing. They get targeted and they can't play their best footy. So what I'd love to see is that midfield taking a few risks, throw some young guys who are banging on the door in there again, but put them all in there together. Guys like Clay Hall, Elijah Hewitt, Bo Allen, Tom Gross, and just a mix of the more physical senior guys in there with them, like Liam Baker and Jack Graham, to basically put forward a midfield that's going to compete physically in every contest. And if it costs games, at least the guys go down swinging, as opposed to trying to get that attacking mix. You get our attacking midfielders just tagged out of the game, and then they're not really running defensively enough anyway inside the centre bounces especially. Anyway, that's just my take on where I think West Coast needs to turn to really resolve a big problem. I'm sure that either way there will be some changes in opportunity in the next couple of weeks. And personally, I'm really excited to see what young players will get that opportunity at the next team selection. So on that note, thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll hopefully see you guys all again next week. Until then,